So, welcome everybody to this episode of the Humpty Project. I want to introduce to you Michele Price. Michele is an Indigenous leadership advisor, helping today's changemakers evolve beyond outdated power structures. Michele guides executives and emerging leaders in recalibrating their skills to build ethical, inclusive organizations ready for the future. With over 20 years' experience advising C-suite leaders, she blends ancestral wisdom, systems thinking, and emotional intelligence to activate purpose-driven leadership. Michele agreed to share her thoughts on what we might call the workplace of tomorrow and her insight about how today's business leaders can evolve and adapt to the next generation of people entering the workforce. Just as technology continues to advance exponentially, workplace norms and expectations are rapidly evolving. So, Michele, welcome. I think we realize that this is a big topic where we could go in many directions, but there's a few points that we spoke about earlier that we thought we'd cover for the audience here. And one of them was Gen Z employees valuing freedom and flexibility at work. They want the ability to work remotely and set their own schedules. And giving them that flexibility can show trust and value that you value their work-life balance. So, can you share your thoughts on that bullet point?
Certainly, and thank you. I appreciate you having me on. One of the things that I'm finding really interesting as well as fascinating is the dance that a majority of current leadership is putting themselves through. Some of it's really unnecessary. And it makes me wonder how often they're actually engaging in personal development for themselves. They want their people to show up as their best selves. And what I've discovered over the years is if you aren't doing that work, how are you actually going to recognize that in your own people? I mean, obviously, as humans who've been, once we get to a certain age, we have a distinct understanding of being able to recognize excellence. But the thing that I'm really observing a lot of leaders have a challenge with is being able to take a deep breath and use questions as a way to help them be able to see other people clearer. By saying things like, my own definition of excellence is this. When was the last time you asked your people, each one individually? Don't ask them as a group, because then you're going to get groupthink. But ask each one individually, what does excellence look like for you? And how can I support you so that you're able to deliver that for yourself as well as for the company?
When you speak, and I've taken a few notes, it sounds like there's that classic chasm that exists beyond being a manager, doing and managing people and telling them what to do, versus leading and mentoring. Am I right in
Yes.
that you're describing that sort of challenge for today's seasoned managers, that they don't necessarily do much more than go beyond autopilot that which they know, and they continue to operate in the same way?
And it's not that they do it across the board in everything. And I think that's what actually trips them up. They'll have areas where they may excel in how they lead, but then they have other areas that they don't. And those have become blind spots to them. So in their minds, they're thinking they're doing a really great job. But when was the last time they actually were assessed by their people in their words? And was it even safe for them to give you real answers so that you can learn where you can up level your own skills? It's very much a dance. And so if you're still trying to use the 1950s jitterbug music, and everybody else is,
What's the
they've moved
jitterbug?
past Dealey Stan, so there's our Gen X, and they've moved past Ariana Grande, and there's our millennial. Who are the Gen Z listening to, and what is that energy like for them, and how are you leading them where they're at first. Don't expect them to meet you where you are. You have all these decades of experience, expertise, and knowledge. Your role as a leader is to actually meet them where they're at, bring the vision to them in ways they can understand it. And then together, you're supposed to be finding ways that you can both go together forward and progress.
So I'd like to think that I'm one of the more seasoned professionals that's challenged himself to think differently and always question my biases and my blind spots. But I believe that I've got enough history in my mind and work experience to be able to sometimes get into the mind of others that are my age and managing teams, managing companies. And we go back to the point of the top of this particular bullet point, not the topic, but this bullet point: freedom and flexibility at work, work from home, remote, flexible hours, maybe 4-day work weeks with 10-hour days, something like that. How do we help people that have been managing teams and managing organizations for 20 or 30 years? How do we help them understand how to make that transition? Is trust earned by those Generation Z workers that want to have this flexibility? How do we gain trust in an organization when we've been programmed for so long to kind of manage by walking around, if you will?
Great question. And the and what I'm going to say might surprise some people, and then again, it might not. And that is, that's your job. If you're expecting them to bring all their skills and expertise and produce outcomes and results, what are you doing to help produce outcomes and results? How are you, one, working on yourself first? And how are you bringing that to the table? Too often, what I'm seeing, and you brought up two really great roles and definitions that I think are important, and that is manage and lead. Two very different tasks. And without going backwards, because I think your listeners already have a pretty well defined difference between managing and leading. How are you doing an analysis on who you are right now? And where are you on a daily basis with your list that you've written out for yourself? Because that's your stuff to work on. Where are you working on each one of those things on your list so that in real time you're discovering how to close and bridge your gaps? Because that's what we're seeing in leadership right now. We're seeing, for lack of a pretty way of saying it, people dig their heels in from the leadership perspective. I'm like, come on. You're you're too mature for that. Quit operating from ego and start asking yourself some better questions. Because really, when you're using questions in a way where it's expanding everyone's opportunity to explore and do things together, that's really different than using questions from a manipulative perspective, which is what I even watch on LinkedIn. Sometimes they use their questions, their posts, or even their comments from a perspective of, they take the words and they twist it so that you're going to either agree with them. I mean, sometimes they give themselves away in how they lead off their comments. And so that's a really great thing for leaders to be looking at right now. How are you leading off your conversations with your people? I just read something yesterday where someone led off with, well, I would argue that. And I'm like, well, there's problem number one right there. You just told me you're about to argue, not problem solve.
That's a pretty obvious when you think about it in the context of conversation. When you use a term like that, it's clear to me that the tone is set. And what you brought to me is a book that I recently read, maybe even not that recently, but within the last year, called Multipliers by Liz Wiseman. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
I
it
had one
described,
on my radio show about, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago.
okay, well, it for those who don't know the work, the book called Multipliers, my very basic takeaway is there's two general types of ways of approaching things. And we talked about managing and leading, but multipliers multiply the skills and talents of those around them and build up teams, and diminishers diminish the works of those around them and tear down teams. And diminishers really are driven by that three-letter word you used earlier, ego, in so many cases. So one way I think leaders can work on themselves is to simply, well, you have to be open, but you can read a book and say, I read the book and check the box, but you really need to be open and say, how do those traits apply to me? And I find that I have a real strong tendency towards some diminishing traits. I can suck up all the oxygen in the room, sometimes not because I'm trying to, but because I try to fill dead space, or I think I'm throwing out all these great ideas and I want one of them to stick and then the team to run with it. And what's happening is the team will often say, okay, we're just waiting for you to tell us what direction to go, because I'm not giving them time to speak. I'm not giving them time to evolve their thoughts.
Yeah, because I know one of the things that's being brought up in a lot of the articles and posts around um, return, how a lot of CEOs want everyone to return back to office, and the dynamics and the challenge that that's causing. And then, of course, the question you ask is, how do they lead when so many people are in remote? And I'm like, that means you actually need to have a personal relationship with each of your employees. Now, obviously, there's structure when you have certain size employees, and that's why you have managers and other leaders in place of that. So even when you're the CEO of a large corporation, how often are you taking the time to get to know people below some of your senior leadership structures and talk directly to them? Have a relationship directly with them and learn from them. Because the whole point of having employees is you're bringing their skills and their talent to the pool in order for everybody to be able to produce together. It amazes me how many times people want to tell folks what to do. And I'm like, that's not why you hired them. You hired them to actually bring that thought process and that skill to your talent pool. Why aren't you asking them more questions around, here's what we've done, here's what we've tried, here's our end goal? We also realize there's going to be things we don't know, because this right here, whatever that piece is that you're working on because of their talent, is not our area of expertise. What can we learn from you? What are you bringing to the table in order to help us find a better solution for this? Because our customers are saying what we do now doesn't work for us. And then shut up and listen.
Shut up and listen is still something I'm working on, and actively listening, not listening to reply, but really listening to add value and clear the room for others to add value. But what you prompted me to think about was an interaction I had with I once worked for the CEO of a relatively large public company, and the fellow was notorious in the industry. There were those who compared him to, one person said, there's three people I wouldn't work for: Adolf Hitler, um, Bin Laden, and this fellow. So he was a notoriously difficult and challenging. And I remember once he brought me into his office and sales were a bit down. And I remember saying, I think something. And he said, I don't pay you to think, I pay you to sell. And I challenged him again. He said, stop talking. I don't pay you to think, I pay you to sell. And that bridges me to another conversation with him. And the second point that I think our listeners will want to hear your thoughts on, and that is transparency. And the reason I bring this segue is because I remember he would have quarterly meetings. He'd gather everybody in the cafeteria, and we'd all sit on chairs, and he'd go over the company results and high level figures, those figures he could share that weren't, were able to be shared since we were publicly traded. And I remember once he asked me after one of the sessions how I think it went. And I said, well, it didn't really go very well because there was this point where he said, myself and the board chairman, we didn't even get a bonus last year. Basically we're sucking it up. We're tightening our belts. So that's why we've had layoffs and other things. And I said, he said, but I'm trying to be more empathetic. And I said, Roy, walk around the company. You don't even know anyone's name generally. You know about 5 people's name within this office outside of your direct reports. And he thought that just having a meeting and just laying out everything, company goals, policies, and procedures was all you need to do. But he was always flabbergasted by the fact that nobody asked questions. And he at least would confide in me and ask me these things. And I think I realized then 10 or 15 years ago that what a leader thinks is transparency is not necessarily what Gen Z is looking for. They're looking for, from all the studies I've read, they're looking to clearly understand company goals, policies, procedures. They want to understand why. They don't want to understand what are they so I can follow them, but they want to understand why things are in place. And a transparent work culture helps build their confidence and engagement. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to share more insight on that.
Oh, yes, the what and the why. This generation is giving us an opportunity to really understand what interconnectedness means. And so often, what I'm finding is my peers from older generations are still hung up on archaic definitions and rules. And you brought a couple of words up that I would highlight and remind listeners today to start asking themselves a few questions. Where is my leadership pretending it's being transparent, but asking for compliance? And what does that really look like? Too often, what I've observed is people, especially in senior leadership, have been rewarded, and it's not their fault, so I'm just going to say this out loud. They've been rewarded for behaviors that are in direct conflict with what they need the base of their people to be doing. And so they're being held responsible for things from the board or the expectations for how they're going to deliver results for different stakeholders, but investors, while everyone else is required to deliver results for the customer.
It's a pretty big chasm, isn't it?
It's a very big gap. And oftentimes people aren't asking the hard questions around how do we bridge that and how do we allow ourselves to progress so that we're being clear, accurate, and authentic. And I get it. People are tired of hearing the word transparency and authenticity because a lot of times they're not supported in actually delivering that. So whether it's your boots on the ground, people aren't supported, or sometimes even the CEO is not supported in delivering that. That means that senior leadership and CEOs have to be willing to ask the harder questions. Saying you're empathetic and being empathetic are two totally different things. And that is exactly why CEOs and senior leadership need advisors, advisors who are willing to ask them the really hard questions, and advisors that don't look like everyone else they've surrounded themselves with.
Yeah, that's a common thread in so many things in life. Is that we tend to dip into the same pool of candidates, people that look like us, talk like us, maybe write an email or a letter like us. And one of the episodes I had, and I believe you and I were introduced by Dr. Sheva Guy, and I had her on the podcast. I think it was my fourth episode. It was called "Wear the Damn Earring" because I pierced my ear when I was 27 and have never ever worn it in business. And I said, I like wearing an earring and I'm going to wear it in business. And I've started doing that this year after that episode. But I found that even bringing that tiny bit of my authentic self brings funny, haha comments, strange looks. Um, and part of the reason I do the podcast is I'm probably the demographic that's most safe to put more controversial thoughts out there sometimes. Things that really don't seem that controversial, even just wearing an earring. I know when I grew up, tattoos were big taboo and so forth. And now lots of people have tattoos. In fact, I have two. But I used to look down on that. So we talk about this authentic self and we don't really mean it. Bring your authentic self, but dress a certain way, speak a certain way. We want to have a flexible workplace, but we expect you here on the dot at 8 a.m. Now if you need to finish something and we see you leaving at 5, we're gonna look down on you for not staying late and giving that little bit to close a project, let's say, or finish something else. But so we have these expectations on the back end that you work extra hours to get the job done, but you better be in at 8. No flexibility in when you arrive, but we expect flexibility on when you leave. I've experienced that. I don't know if I described it well, but and it doesn't necessarily go to transparency, which was the point here, but it goes to many of the points you brought up. So we keep our listeners engaged here. I think there's one more point that's interesting too, and then that is that the next generation tells us that they crave continuous learning and development opportunities. They want to gain new skills and they want to apply those skills. So providing learning resources and supporting their growth is going to be key in retaining the next generation of talent. What has your experience been on that point?
What I've noticed is a lot of times this is another area that leadership has not given themselves permission to let go of their grip.
Okay.
And the fascinating thing about that is a lot of times it has to do with how well people know themselves. So I'm going to throw a glove down to leadership that's listening and ask them, what have you done to get to know yourself better? And I don't mean on the surface, I don't mean just the simple act of reading a book. I mean doing some really strong inner work, picking a skill that maybe you don't necessarily need in order to be the CEO, but pick a skill from one of your people that they're really good at. What if you went and took some workshops and classes on that and then used that as an opportunity to relate to that employee and to do some brainstorming and mapping? How can we improve our product or our service by using what you just learned and they already know how to deliver? Talk about being able to uncover ways to put their talent to work in you to expand your thinking and your own skills and talent, that's something that customers will pay attention to. Because now what you've done is you've put the spotlight not just on your employee, their skill, their talent, what they can deliver. You put the spotlight on how are we going to solve problems in a way that our customers are going to be happier and want to continue doing business.
You come back to the word customers in that part of conversation, but earlier you talked about the dichotomy between stakeholder, shareholder satisfaction and customer satisfaction. So I think, again, it's highlighting the point that businesses need to have a keener balance on understanding what customers want and desire. And an observation I make is that with the web-based services that are out there, uh, consumers can move quickly and learn about your products, but they can also learn about your weaknesses in service and support and other areas. So if you're not challenging yourself as a business to really hear the voice of the customer and then take actions on it, and again, the people that are closest to those customers are going to be the people you need to listen to about maybe what actions need to be taken. I think we all have to realize we don't have all of the answers. So that was one of the first things that popped into my mind, is that leaders today really need to understand that balance between keeping the shareholders happy, but driving a good customer experience.
Yeah, it's it just fascinates me how, and I'll bring it back to another piece of practicality. Part of the reason why what I do with clients is so successful, bringing the Indigenous lens in, is because I'm allowing people to start looking at their power structure and to recognize, where have I placed more weight on myself or other roles or other actions within the circle of what we're doing inside of our company. Are we putting more weight on what our clients need? Or are we putting more weight on our employees? Are we putting more weight on the results I'm able to deliver shareholders? Wherever that is, and it's expanding outside of the circle like a pimple, that's where the infection is.
Yeah, there's a visual for you, a pimple and an infection. But and I love having these conversations with people because it gets so many creative juices in my mind going, and it challenges me to take some things away as well. I believe that I've evolved to somebody that I believe can relate more to the Gen Zs when it comes to all that we've just been discussing in the last few minutes, and that is shareholder value. I sometimes say stakeholder, but I think too often it's very biased towards shareholder. And we reward capital in this country much differently than we reward labor. And I believe a lot of Gen Z are seeing that. They're very cynical about things. And I think those that have grown up with a pure bottom line focused and, dare I say, that trickle down mentality are going to find that if that pervades their ways of really going to market and how they manage their company and their people, they're going to fall behind in retaining these younger people. And I can relate to it. I'm definitely one that benefits from the recent tax cuts and tax code and all that we have in this country to support the top few percent. But it's not necessarily that I believe the same way in it as I did 30 or 40 years ago. And I think we see such huge gaps in wealth continuing to drive the middle class apart and almost to a super wealthy and a lower middle class to a lower class economically. So I think I'm a little bit off topic here, but I
Sounds
do
like a
think
future episode.
it does. But I do think that being able to understand and empathize, and you went to that earlier, why do people that are younger hold this sometimes disdain of capitalism? Or how does that relate to them when they work for a company that's just talking about we've got to hit our numbers, this is our quarterly budget, and that is the central focus? You're not going to retain a lot of people that way. And even, you can put the lipstick on the pig, as was used in some political campaigns years ago, but you can't dress it up if beyond what it really is. So when you can understand and empathize with how and why do the younger generations see today's society and today's economy not necessarily favoring them. And the example I can quickly go to is I bought a home when I was 18 years old. That home was $20,000. I was making $5.50 an hour. So I was pretty proud of myself for being able to buy a home. Now interest rates are sky high. I was making 1.8 times the minimum wage. And I saw on Zillow what that house is worth today. And if I was making 1.8 times minimum wage, that mortgage would now cost me 44% of my income. Back when I bought it, it was 24, 28% of my income. So there is something going on that the younger generation doesn't feel like they have the same opportunity as their parents or grandparents. And when I hear people in my age group in business say, just get out there and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, um, it doesn't resonate. So that's where I was trying to go with all of that. Uh, you may or may not agree with some of
Example
it.
of what? When you talked about stakeholder profits, hit the numbers, that's the what. And when people's why is in conflict with your what, they're not going to dance with you.
Right. Well, we're wrapping up the scheduled time we allotted for this. And as you mentioned, there's probably another time if you're so inclined to join and go deeper into. We can go into so many different topics, and there's other points in terms of uh, recruiting, retaining, and really motivating the next generation of workers. But what I'd like to end with is some final thoughts from you. And I will share, this will be both a podcast and a video podcast. So I will share information in the notes as to how to reach you. But what final thoughts would you like to add in the next minute or so?
How about instead of trying to, God, you just said something and I wanted to use it and then I lost it. Instead of trying to motivate your employees, what are you doing to actually bring a better yourself to the game? Because they've invested in themselves, but they aren't genuinely seeing how you're investing in yourself so that the two of you can progress instead of fight with one another.
So much more than just a free lunch or a company picnic, you're saying, to motivate people. Michele, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. I appreciate you taking the time. Again, I'll share your contact information that you've provided to me, and I look forward to staying in touch with you, following you on LinkedIn, and perhaps having another discussion in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me on.
Have a great day.